Lost dog protects toddler all night. The family's reaction will warm your heart. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The town of Willowbrook had always been a quiet, unassuming place. Nestled among rolling hills and dense woods, it was a community where everyone knew each other, and life moved at a gentle pace. It was the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other warmly, and the biggest excitement often came from weekend fairs or a new addition to the local library. For the Parker family, it was home, a place of comfort and routine. Megan and Dan Parker had settled here a few years ago, drawn to the tranquility that seemed to blanket the town like a warm embrace. Their son, Tommy, was the light of their lives. Barely 2 years old, Tommy was a bundle of curiosity, his laughter ringing through the house like a melody. With his bright blue eyes and a mop of golden curls, he was the kind of child who could charm anyone with just a smile. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Megan was busy preparing dinner while Dan worked on some repairs in the garage. Tommy played in the backyard, his small hands exploring the grass, leaves, and whatever tiny treasures he could find. The yard was fenced, and they had always felt it was a safe space for him. But as the minutes ticked by, Megan realized the usual sound of Tommy's giggles had faded into silence. "Dan," she called, her voice carrying a hint of unease. "Have you seen Tommy?" Dan popped his head out from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. "He's in the yard, isn't he?" Megan's brow furrowed as she stepped outside. The yard was empty. The small plastic truck Tommy had been playing with lay abandoned near the sandbox. Her heart skipped a beat as she scanned the area, calling his name. "Tommy? Tommy, where are you?" Panic began to creep into her voice as Dan joined her, his face growing pale. Together, they searched every corner of the yard, their calls becoming more frantic with each passing second. The gate was latched, but there was a small gap underneath the wooden fence, just big enough for a curious toddler to squeeze through. "Oh my God," Megan whispered, clutching Dan's arm. What if he wandered off? Dan didn't waste a moment. Grabbing his phone, he called the neighbors, asking them to help look for Tommy. Within minutes, a small search party had formed, people spreading out to comb through the nearby streets and woods. Meanwhile, as the Parker family and their neighbors frantically searched for the missing child, a lone figure wandered through the wooded outskirts of town. The dog was a mix of breeds, its brown and white coat marked with patches of dirt. He moved with the cautious gait of an animal that had been on its own for some time, his ribs faintly visible beneath his fur. But despite his rough appearance, there was a gentleness in his amber eyes, a spark of intelligence that belied his stray existence. The dog's ears twitched as he picked up a faint sound, soft cries carried on the wind. He paused, sniffing the air, and began to move toward the source. The cries grew louder as he neared a small clearing, and there, sitting on the cold, damp ground, was a little boy. Tommy's face was streaked with tears, his tiny hands clutching a handful of leaves. His clothes were smeared with dirt, and his cheeks were flushed from crying. The dog approached cautiously, his head low and his movements slow. Tommy looked up, his watery blue eyes meeting the dog's gaze. For a moment, the two simply stared at each other, as if trying to understand what had brought them together in this unexpected place. Then, with a trembling hand, Tommy reached out toward the dog. The dog sniffed Tommy's outstretched fingers before gently licking them. A small, hiccuping laugh escaped the boy, breaking the tension of the moment. Encouraged by the child's reaction, the dog stepped closer, his warm, furry body providing a comforting presence against the chill of the evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the woods grew darker and colder. The dog instinctively sensed the need to keep the boy safe. He lay down beside Tommy, curling his body around the child to shield him from the night's chill. Tommy, still clutching the leaves, leaned into the dog's warmth, his small frame finally relaxing as exhaustion overtook him. Back in Willowbrook, Megan and Dan were desperate. The search party had scoured the immediate area with no sign of Tommy. The local authorities had been called, and volunteers with flashlights began to comb through the woods. Megan clung to Dan, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "We have to find him. He's so little. He'll be so scared." Dan squeezed her hand, his own fear barely concealed. "We'll find him. We have to." Hours passed, the once clear sky now blanketed with clouds that obscured the moonlight. The woods felt vast and unforgiving, a labyrinth of shadows and rustling leaves. Every snapping twig and distant rustle sent waves of hope and dread through the searchers. Meanwhile, Tommy and the dog remained in their makeshift shelter in the clearing. The dog stayed alert, his ears swiveling at every sound. At one point, the distant howl of a coyote reached his ears, and he let out a low, warning growl. He didn't move from his position, keeping his body firmly between Tommy and the direction of the sound. Tommy stirred, his tiny hand gripping a handful of the dog's fur. "Doggy," he murmured sleepily, his voice barely a whisper. The dog's tail thumped softly against the ground, a reassuring response to the boy's trust. As dawn approached, the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees, casting a soft golden glow over the woods. The dog raised his head, sniffing the air. He could hear faint voices in the distance. The search party was getting closer. Tommy blinked awake, rubbing his eyes with his fists. He looked around, his expression a mixture of confusion and relief as he realized the dog was still by his side. "Doggy," he said again, his voice stronger now. The dog stood, his tail wagging as he nudged Tommy gently. It was as if he knew help was on the way. The voices in the distance grew louder, carried on the crisp morning breeze. The dog's ears perked, his body tensing as he tried to determine whether these sounds meant safety or danger. Tommy, still groggy from sleep, clung to the dog's side, his tiny hand gripping a patch of fur as if it were a lifeline. For the dog, there was no question. This small, helpless human was now under his care, and he would protect him at all costs. Tommy's voice, small but hopeful, broke the stillness. "Mommy? Daddy?" His call was tentative, unsure if the familiar faces he longed for would suddenly emerge from the trees. The dog let out a soft whine, almost as if encouraging him to try again. "Mommy!" Tommy called louder this time, his voice echoing through the woods. The search party, spread thin across the vast forest, heard the faint cry. Megan froze, her heart pounding as the word registered. "Did you hear that?" she asked, gripping Dan's arm tightly. Her voice was trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. Dan nodded, his own breath catching as he strained to listen. "Tommy, Tommy, where are you?" Megan's voice cracked as she shouted, her flashlight sweeping wildly across the underbrush. Dan joined in, his deep voice booming through the forest, calling their son's name with a desperation that made those around him pause. The dog heard the shouts and immediately recognized the urgency in their tone. He let out a series of short, sharp barks, his instinct telling him that these sounds would guide the humans closer. Tommy, emboldened by the dog's actions, began to call out again. "Mommy! Daddy!" His voice was louder now, filled with the simple, unwavering faith that his parents would come for him. Megan's legs carried her faster than she thought possible, her flashlight barely illuminating the path as she followed the faint sound of her son's voice. Dan was right behind her, his face set in grim determination. The other searchers fanned out, their own calls echoing through the forest as they tried to pinpoint the source of the cries. And then, through the trees, Megan saw it. A small clearing bathed in the soft glow of the rising sun. Her heart leapt as she spotted a tiny figure standing near the edge, his blonde curls unmistakable even from a distance. "Tommy!" she screamed, tears streaming down her face as she sprinted toward him. Tommy turned at the sound of her voice, his face lighting up with pure joy. "Mommy!" he cried, his arms outstretched. But before Megan could reach him, the dog stepped in front of the boy, his body stiff and protective. His amber eyes locked onto Megan, assessing her as she drew closer. Dan caught up just in time to see the scene unfold. "It's okay, boy," he said softly, holding his hands up in a gesture of peace. "We're his parents. Thank you for keeping him safe." The dog's ears twitched at Dan's voice, and after a moment's hesitation, he seemed to understand. He stepped aside, allowing Megan to scoop Tommy into her arms. She held him tightly, rocking back and forth as sobs of relief racked her body. "Oh, my baby," she whispered, pressing kisses to his dirt-streaked cheeks. "I was so scared. I thought I'd lost you." Dan knelt beside them, wrapping his arms around both his wife and son. He rested his forehead against Tommy's, his own tears falling freely. "You're okay," he murmured. "You're safe now." It was then that Megan noticed the dog standing a few feet away. His head tilted slightly as he watched the reunion. Her tear-filled eyes met his, and she understood immediately. "You stayed with him," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You protected him all night, didn't you?" The dog's tail wagged hesitantly, as if he wasn't sure what to make of the attention. Tommy, still nestled in his mother's arms, reached out toward the dog. "Doggy," he said, his voice filled with affection. "Good doggy." The dog stepped closer, his nose gently brushing against Tommy's outstretched hand. Dan placed a hand on the dog's head, scratching behind his ears. "You're a hero, you know that?" he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved our boy." The search party began to arrive in the clearing, their relieved cheers filling the air as they realized Tommy had been found. People crowded around, offering blankets, water, and words of comfort to the Parker family. But amidst the chaos, the dog stayed close to Tommy, his protective instincts refusing to waver. One of the searchers, a middle-aged man named Frank, approached Dan. "You know, I've seen a lot of stray dogs around here, but none like this one. He's something special." Dan nodded, his hand still resting on the dog's head. "Yeah, he is. I don't know where he came from, but he's part of our family now." Megan looked up at her husband, her tear-streaked face softening with a small smile. "You mean it?" "Of course I do," Dan replied. "This dog saved our son. There's no way we're letting him go." Tommy, now wrapped in a warm blanket, looked up at his parents with wide eyes. "Doggy stay?" he asked, his voice hopeful. Megan hugged him tightly, her smile growing. "Yes, sweetheart. Doggy stays." The dog seemed to sense the decision, his tail wagging more enthusiastically as he nuzzled Tommy's cheek. The boy giggled, the sound like music to Megan's ears after the long, harrowing night. As the Parker family made their way back to town, the dog walked beside them, his head held high. People stopped to watch, their hearts swelling at the sight of the courageous animal who had kept a lost child safe. Word of the dog's heroism spread quickly, and by the time they reached their house, neighbors were already waiting to greet them. "Is it true?" one woman asked, her hands pressed to her chest. "That dog stayed with Tommy all night?" Megan nodded, tears welling up again as she recounted the story. "He kept him warm, protected him. I don't even want to think about what could have happened if he hadn't been there." The crowd murmured in awe, their admiration for the dog growing with every word. Someone suggested giving him a name, and Tommy, still clutching the dog's fur, piped up, "Buddy." Dan grinned. "Buddy it is." As the Parker family settled back into their home, the events of the past 24 hours still felt like a dream. The adrenaline from finding Tommy had worn off, replaced by a deep exhaustion that settled in their bones. But amidst the overwhelming relief, one thing remained constant. Buddy, the dog who had saved their son, was now an inseparable part of their lives. Tommy refused to let Buddy out of his sight, his small hands always reaching for the dog's fur, as if afraid he might disappear. Buddy seemed to understand this unspoken fear and stayed close, his presence a steady reassurance for the toddler. Whether it was sitting at the kitchen table during breakfast or curling up by Tommy's bed during nap time, Buddy was always there, his watchful eyes never leaving the child. That first evening back home, the Parkers decided to give Buddy a proper meal. Dan opened a can of dog food they'd picked up from a neighbor, and the moment Buddy caught the scent, his tail wagged furiously. "Poor guy must be starving," Dan said as he placed the bowl on the floor. Buddy devoured the food with gusto, pausing only to glance up at the family as if to say thank you. Tommy giggled, clapping his hands. "Buddy hungry," he exclaimed, his laughter filling the room. Megan watched the scene with a smile, her heart swelling with gratitude. "He's part of the family now," she said softly, exchanging a glance with Dan. "I can't believe we were lucky enough to find him." But as the days passed, it became clear that Buddy wasn't just a dog. He had a way of understanding things that went beyond the ordinary. When Tommy became restless, Buddy would nudge him gently toward his toys, distracting him with playful nudges and wagging his tail. When Megan was busy in the kitchen, Buddy would sit by the doorway, his presence a quiet comfort. And when Dan returned from work each evening, Buddy would greet him at the door, his tail wagging as if to say, "Welcome home." Word of Buddy's heroism spread quickly through the town. Neighbors stopped by to meet the dog who had saved Tommy, each bringing treats or toys as tokens of appreciation. Even the local newspaper ran a story about him, complete with a picture of Buddy sitting proudly beside Tommy. The headline read, "Local Dog Becomes Hero, Protects Toddler Lost in Woods." Despite all the attention, Buddy remained humble, if a dog could be called that. He seemed uninterested in the fuss, his focus always on the Parker family, particularly Tommy. The bond between the two grew stronger with each passing day. Tommy would curl up beside Buddy during story time, his tiny fingers stroking the dog's fur as Megan read aloud from his favorite books. Once upon a time, Megan began one evening, her voice soft and soothing. Tommy listened intently, but his hand never left Buddy's side. It wasn't long before Buddy's presence began to change the family in unexpected ways. For Dan, who had always been a man of action, Buddy reminded him of the importance of stillness. Watching the dog's quiet vigilance over Tommy made him more aware of the small moments, the laughter during bath time, the way Tommy's face lit up when he spotted a butterfly in the yard. "He's teaching us something," Dan said one evening as he and Megan sat on the porch, watching Tommy play with Buddy in the yard. "He's showing us what it means to truly be present." Megan nodded, her gaze fixed on the pair. "I think he was meant to find us," she said. "It's like he knew Tommy needed him." One weekend, the Parkers decided to take Buddy to the vet for a checkup. They wanted to make sure he was healthy and learn more about his past, if possible. The local vet, Dr. Harper, was a kind woman in her 40s who had been caring for animals in Willowbrook for over a decade. She greeted Buddy with a warm smile, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears. "So this is the famous Buddy," she said. "I've heard so much about you." Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. Dr. Harper examined him carefully, checking his teeth, ears, and coat. "He's in remarkably good shape for a stray," she said, her tone thoughtful. "No signs of malnourishment or major injuries. He must have been on his own for a while, but he's clearly been cared for at some point." Megan furrowed her brow. "Do you think he had an owner before?" Dr. Harper nodded. "It's possible. He's got the demeanor of a trained dog, calm, attentive, and incredibly loyal. If he did have an owner, they must have loved him very much." The thought tugged at Megan's heart. Had Buddy been separated from someone he cared about? Had he been searching for a family when he stumbled upon Tommy in the woods? She reached out to scratch Buddy's head, her voice soft. "Well, he's with us now," Dr. Harper smiled. "And I'd say he's exactly where he's meant to be." As they left the clinic, Tommy clung to Buddy's leash, his tiny legs struggling to keep up with the dog's steady pace. "Buddy, good boy," he said proudly, looking up at Megan and Dan. They both laughed, the sound lightening the air. Back at home, life continued to settle into a new rhythm. Buddy became a constant presence not just for the Parkers but for the entire neighborhood. Children would run to the fence to call his name, their laughter ringing out as Buddy wagged his tail in greeting. Even the mailman, who had always been wary of dogs, found himself stopping to give Buddy a pat on the head. But for all the joy Buddy brought, there were still moments that hinted at his mysterious past. Late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, Buddy would sometimes sit by the window, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness outside. It was as if he were waiting for something or someone. Megan noticed it one evening as she came downstairs to grab a glass of water. She paused in the doorway, watching the dog's silhouette framed by the moonlight. "Buddy," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The dog turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, there was a sadness there, a depth of emotion that caught Megan off guard. She crossed the room and knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. "Whatever you're looking for," she murmured. "I hope you found it here." Buddy leaned into her touch, his tail thumping softly against the floor. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. As the Parker family settled back into their home, the events of the past 24 hours still felt like a dream. The adrenaline from finding Tommy had worn off, replaced by a deep exhaustion that settled in their bones. But amidst the overwhelming relief, one thing remained constant. Buddy, the dog who had saved their son, was now an inseparable part of their lives. Tommy refused to let Buddy out of his sight, his small hands always reaching for the dog's fur, as if afraid he might disappear. Buddy seemed to understand this unspoken fear and stayed close, his presence a steady reassurance for the toddler. Whether it was sitting at the kitchen table during breakfast or curling up by Tommy's bed during nap time, Buddy was always there, his watchful eyes never leaving the child. That first evening back home, the Parkers decided to give Buddy a proper meal. Dan opened a can of dog food they'd picked up from a neighbor, and the moment Buddy caught the scent, his tail wagged furiously. "Poor guy must be starving," Dan said as he placed the bowl on the floor. Buddy devoured the food with gusto, pausing only to glance up at the family as if to say thank you. Tommy giggled, clapping his hands. "Buddy hungry," he exclaimed, his laughter filling the room. Megan watched the scene with a smile, her heart swelling with gratitude. "He's part of the family now," she said softly, exchanging a glance with Dan. "I can't believe we were lucky enough to find him." But as the days passed, it became clear that Buddy wasn't just a dog. He had a way of understanding things that went beyond the ordinary. When Tommy became restless, Buddy would nudge him gently toward his toys, distracting him with playful nudges and wagging his tail. When Megan was busy in the kitchen, Buddy would sit by the doorway, his presence a quiet comfort. And when Dan returned from work each evening, Buddy would greet him at the door, his tail wagging as if to say, "Welcome home." Word of Buddy's heroism spread quickly through the town. Neighbors stopped by to meet the dog who had saved Tommy, each bringing treats or toys as tokens of appreciation. Even the local newspaper ran a story about him, complete with a picture of Buddy sitting proudly beside Tommy. The headline read, "Local dog becomes hero, protects toddler lost in woods." Despite all the attention, Buddy remained humble, if a dog could be called that. He seemed uninterested in the fuss, his focus always on the Parker family, particularly Tommy. The bond between the two grew stronger with each passing day. Tommy would curl up beside Buddy during story time, his tiny fingers stroking the dog's fur as Megan read aloud from his favorite books. Once upon a time, Megan began one evening, her voice soft and soothing. Tommy listened intently, but his hand never left Buddy's side. It wasn't long before Buddy's presence began to change the family in unexpected ways. For Dan, who had always been a man of action, Buddy reminded him of the importance of stillness. Watching the dog's quiet vigilance over Tommy made him more aware of the small moments, the laughter during bath time, the way Tommy's face lit up when he spotted a butterfly in the yard. "He's teaching us something," Dan said one evening as he and Megan sat on the porch, watching Tommy play with Buddy in the yard. "He's showing us what it means to truly be present." Megan nodded, her gaze fixed on the pair. "I think he was meant to find us," she said. "It's like he knew Tommy needed him." One weekend, the Parkers decided to take Buddy to the vet for a checkup. They wanted to make sure he was healthy and learn more about his past, if possible. The local vet, Dr. Harper, was a kind woman in her 40s who had been caring for animals in Willowbrook for over a decade. She greeted Buddy with a warm smile, kneeling down to scratch behind his ears. "So this is the famous Buddy," she said. "I've heard so much about you." Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. Dr. Harper examined him carefully, checking his teeth, ears, and coat. "He's in remarkably good shape for a stray," she said, her tone thoughtful. "No signs of malnourishment or major injuries. He must have been on his own for a while, but he's clearly been cared for at some point." Megan furrowed her brow. Do you think he had an owner before? Dr. Harper nodded. It's possible. He's got the demeanor of a trained dog, calm, attentive, and incredibly loyal. If he did have an owner, they must have loved him very much. The thought tugged at Megan's heart. Had Buddy been separated from someone he cared about? Had he been searching for a family when he stumbled upon Tommy in the woods? She reached out to scratch Buddy's head, her voice soft. Well, he's with us now, Dr. Harper smiled. And I'd say he's exactly where he's meant to be. As they left the clinic, Tommy clung to Buddy's leash, his tiny legs struggling to keep up with the dog's steady pace. Buddy, good boy, he said proudly, looking up at Megan and Dan. They both laughed, the sound lightening the air. Back at home, life continued to settle into a new rhythm. Buddy became a constant presence not just for the Parkers but for the entire neighborhood. Children would run to the fence to call his name, their laughter ringing out as Buddy wagged his tail in greeting. Even the mailman, who had always been wary of dogs, found himself stopping to give Buddy a pat on the head. But for all the joy Buddy brought, there were still moments that hinted at his mysterious past. Late at night, when the house was quiet and everyone was asleep, Buddy would sometimes sit by the window, his amber eyes fixed on the darkness outside. It was as if he were waiting for something or someone. Megan noticed it one evening as she came downstairs to grab a glass of water. She paused in the doorway, watching the dog's silhouette framed by the moonlight. Buddy, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The dog turned his head, his eyes meeting hers. For a moment, there was a sadness there, a depth of emotion that caught Megan off guard. She crossed the room and knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. Whatever you're looking for, she murmured, I hope you found it here. Buddy leaned into her touch, his tail thumping softly against the floor. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. As the days turned into weeks, Buddy had fully integrated into the Parker household. He had his favorite spot on the living room rug, a cozy blanket Megan had laid out just for him. Tommy would often drag his own toys over to Buddy's corner, content to sit beside his furry protector. For Tommy, Buddy was more than just a pet. He was a guardian, a playmate, and, most importantly, a best friend. The story of Buddy's heroism continued to spread. The local paper ran a follow-up article about him, and soon, people from neighboring towns began to stop by to catch a glimpse of the famous dog. A local baker even brought over a box of gourmet dog treats as a gift. For the bravest dog in Willowbrook, she said with a smile, handing the box to Tommy, who proudly presented it to Buddy. Despite all the attention, the Parkers tried to maintain a sense of normalcy. For them, Buddy wasn't a hero on a pedestal, he was family. Dan often joked that Buddy was the most well-behaved member of the household, a sentiment that earned him a playful nudge from Megan. He's better than you are about cleaning up after himself, she teased one evening as Buddy carefully carried an old tennis ball back to Tommy's toy box. But even as life settled into its new rhythm, Buddy's presence continued to inspire moments of reflection. One evening, as the family sat around the dinner table, Dan brought up a question that had been weighing on his mind. Do you think he had someone before us? He asked, glancing at Buddy, who was lying at Tommy's feet. A family, he seems like he's been loved before. Megan looked thoughtful as she reached down to scratch behind Buddy's ears. Dr. Harper mentioned the same thing, she said. It's possible. But if he did, they're not looking for him now. Dan frowned, the thought clearly bothering him. What if they are? What if someone out there is missing him as much as we'd miss him if he ever got lost? Megan sighed, her gaze softening as she looked at Buddy. If that's the case, I hope they'd be happy to know he's safe and loved, and that he's given us so much in return. Tommy, too young to understand the weight of the conversation, reached down to pat Buddy's head. Buddy mine, he said firmly, his small voice filled with conviction. The conversation lingered in Megan's mind long after the dishes were cleared and the house grew quiet for the night. As she lay in bed, listening to the soft sounds of Tommy's breathing from the baby monitor, she thought about how Buddy had changed their lives in such a short time. It wasn't just about saving Tommy. though that act alone was enough to earn him a lifetime of gratitude. It was about the way he had brought their family closer, reminding them of the simple joys of being present for one another. The next morning, Megan woke to the sound of Tommy giggling. She patted down the hall to find her son sitting on the floor, his toy cars lined up in a neat row. Buddy was lying beside him, his head tilted as he watched Tommy intently. Every so often, the dog would nudge one of the cars with his nose, sending it rolling down the makeshift track Tommy had built. "Buddy, good boy," Tommy exclaimed, clapping his hands. He turned to Megan as she entered the room, his face glowing with happiness. "Mommy, Buddy play cars." Megan laughed, her heart swelling at the sight. "He's a smart dog," she said, kneeling down to join them. She reached out to pet Buddy, who wagged his tail in response. Maybe too smart for his own good. As the days went on, Megan began to notice just how attuned Buddy was to their routines. He seemed to know when Tommy was getting tired, nudging the boy toward his bed before nap time. He would sit by the door when Dan's car pulled into the driveway, ready to greet him with a wagging tail. And when Megan felt overwhelmed by the never-ending demands of parenting, Buddy would rest his head on her lap, his quiet presence a balm for her frayed nerves. One afternoon, Megan decided to take Buddy and Tommy to the park. It was a warm, sunny day, and she thought it would be good for all of them to get some fresh air. As they arrived, Tommy let out a squeal of excitement, pointing toward the playground. "Slide, Mommy, slide." Megan smiled, holding his hand as they made their way over. Buddy trotted alongside them, his tail wagging as he took in the sights and smells of the park. Other children were playing on the swings and climbing structures, their laughter filling the air. Tommy ran to the slide, clambering up the steps with the determination only a toddler could muster. Megan stayed close, her eyes never leaving him as he slid down with a delighted squeal. Buddy stood at the base of the slide, watching intently, as if ready to catch Tommy should he fall. A few other parents noticed Buddy and approached Megan, their curiosity evident. "Is that the dog from the paper?" one woman asked, her toddler tugging at her hand. Megan nodded, smiling as she looked at Buddy. "That's him. He found Tommy when he was lost in the woods." The woman crouched down to pat Buddy's head, her expression filled with admiration. "You're a good boy," she said softly. "Thank you for keeping him safe." Buddy wagged his tail, leaning into her touch before returning his attention to Tommy, who was now running toward the swings. Megan followed, keeping an eye on both her son and her dog. She couldn't help but feel a swell of pride every time someone stopped to comment on Buddy's heroism. But more than that, she felt grateful. Grateful that this incredible animal had come into their lives when they needed him most. As the afternoon turned to evening, Megan gathered Tommy and Buddy, ready to head home. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the park. Tommy was yawning, his energy finally spent, and Buddy walked close to Megan's side, his pace steady and calm. That night, as Tommy drifted off to sleep with Buddy curled up at the foot of his bed, Megan sat with Dan in the living room. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness that felt rare and precious. Dan was flipping through the channels on the TV, but his attention seemed elsewhere. "What's on your mind?" Megan asked, leaning against him. Dan hesitated before speaking. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Buddy being meant to find us." Megan nodded, her expression soft. And I think you're right," he said, his voice steady. "I don't know where he came from or what his life was like before, but I do know that he's exactly where he belongs." Megan smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I think so too." In the weeks that followed, Buddy's bond with the family only grew stronger. Tommy's first word in the morning was often Buddy, and his last thought at night was always for his beloved dog. For Megan and Dan, Buddy had become more than just a pet. He was a symbol of resilience, loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. The Parker family's life became a series of small but profound moments, each one marked by Buddy's quiet presence. For a dog who had once been a stray, he seemed to have slipped seamlessly into his new role as protector and companion. His days were filled with Tommy's laughter, Megan's gentle affection, and Dan's steady admiration. But even as Buddy became an integral part of the family, his past remained a mystery, one the Parkers had come to accept, even as it lingered at the edges of their thoughts. One evening, as the family sat in the backyard, enjoying the last warm days of autumn, Megan noticed Buddy sitting near the edge of the fence, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His posture was calm but purposeful, as if he were waiting for something or someone. She watched him for a moment before joining him, kneeling beside him and resting a hand on his back. "Buddy, what are you thinking about?" she asked softly. The dog didn't move, his amber eyes still focused on the distance. Megan sighed, stroking his fur. "You've brought us so much happiness," she said. "I just hope we've done the same for you." Tommy's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Mommy, come see." He was holding up a leaf, its edges tinged with gold and crimson. "Pretty," he exclaimed, his face lighting up with delight. Megan smiled, standing to join her son. "It's beautiful, Tommy," she said, taking the leaf and twirling it between her fingers. Buddy trotted over, his tail wagging as if to join in the moment. He nuzzled Tommy's cheek, earning a giggle from the boy. Dan, watching from the patio, couldn't help but smile. "You know," he said, leaning back in his chair, "Buddy's the best thing that's happened to this family. It's like he's anchored us somehow." Megan nodded, her gaze soft as she watched Tommy play with Buddy. "He's more than a dog," she said. "He's part of us." The days grew shorter as autumn gave way to winter. The first snowfall of the season brought a new kind of magic to the Parker household. Tommy squealed with delight as he pressed his face to the window, watching the snowflakes drift down. "Snow, Mommy, snow!" Megan laughed, bundling him up in his warmest coat and scarf. "All right, let's go outside. Buddy, you too." The dog barked once, his tail wagging excitedly as Megan opened the door. The cold air bit at their cheeks, but Tommy didn't seem to mind. He ran into the yard, his tiny boots crunching through the fresh snow. Buddy followed, bounding through the drifts with a joy that was infectious. Dan joined them a few minutes later, carrying a small sled. "Who's ready for some fun?" he called, his voice carrying over the crisp air. "Me!" Tommy shouted, raising his arms. "And Buddy!" Megan chuckled, helping Tommy onto the sled. Buddy stood beside him, his tail wagging as if in anticipation of the ride. Dan pulled the sled across the yard, Tommy's laughter ringing out as Buddy ran alongside them. For the Parkers, moments like these were everything. The laughter, the shared joy, the quiet moments of connection. They were reminders of how far they had come since that harrowing night in the woods. And at the center of it all was Buddy, the dog who had brought them together in ways they never could have imagined. But even as the family found their rhythm, life had a way of throwing the unexpected their way. One afternoon, as Megan was tidying up the house, she heard a knock at the door. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she opened it to find a man standing on the porch. He was in his late 40s, with kind eyes and a worn jacket that suggested he'd seen his fair share of hard times. "Can I help you?" Megan asked, her tone polite but cautious. The man hesitated, glancing down at the ground before meeting her gaze. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said, "but I saw the story about your dog in the paper and I think he might have been mine." Megan's heart skipped a beat. She stepped back, her mind racing. "You think Buddy was your dog?" The man nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of hope and sadness. "His name was Max," he said. "I had him for years. He was my best friend. But we got separated a few months ago during a move. I looked everywhere for him, but I never thought I'd see him again. And then I saw the picture in the paper." Megan felt a wave of conflicting emotions. She glanced back into the house, where Buddy was lying on the rug, his head resting on his paws. Tommy was sitting beside him, stacking blocks and chattering away. Buddy looked up, his ears twitching as if sensing the conversation. "I don't know what to say," Megan admitted. "Buddy, Max. He's been such an important part of our family. He saved my son's life." The man's eyes softened. "I know," he said. "I read the story, and I'll always be grateful to him for that. But he's not just a dog to me. His family. Megan hesitated, torn between her loyalty to Buddy and her empathy for the man standing before her. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come in. "Maybe he'll recognize you," she said, her voice uncertain. The man entered the house, his eyes immediately landing on Buddy. The dog stood, his tail wagging tentatively as he approached the stranger. "Max," the man said softly, his voice trembling. "It's me." Buddy stopped a few feet away, his head tilted as he studied the man. For a moment, there was silence. Then Buddy's tail began to wag furiously. He stepped closer, nuzzling the man's hand and letting out a soft whine. The man knelt, wrapping his arms around Buddy's neck. "I missed you, boy," he whispered. "I thought I'd lost you forever." Megan watched the reunion, her heart aching. She could see the bond between the man and Buddy, a connection that spoke of years of shared history. And yet, the thought of letting Buddy go felt unbearable. Tommy toddled over, his wide eyes taking in the scene. "Mommy?" he asked, his voice uncertain. "Buddy okay?" Megan knelt beside him, pulling him into a hug. "Buddy's okay," she said softly. "He's just saying hello." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Megan's. "I don't want to take him away from you," he said. "I can see how much he means to your family, but I had to try." Megan's throat tightened. She looked at Buddy, who was now sitting between the man and Tommy, his tail wagging as if he didn't know where to focus his attention. "Maybe there's a way for all of us to share him," she said, her voice tentative. The man blinked, surprised. "Share him?" Megan nodded. "He's brought so much to our lives, and I can see how much he means to you. Maybe we can figure something out." Dan, who had just entered the room, nodded in agreement. "Buddy has a big heart," he said. "I think he has enough love for all of us." The man's face softened, a small smile breaking through his sadness. "I'd like that," he said. "Thank you." And so, an unexpected arrangement was born. Buddy, or Max, as the man still called him, would spend time with both families, splitting his days between the Parkers and the man who had loved him first. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was one that felt right for everyone involved. For Buddy, it didn't seem to matter where he was, as long as he was surrounded by love. Whether he was chasing Tommy through the yard or sitting by the man's side on a quiet evening, his tail wagged with the same unwavering joy. And for the Parkers, sharing Buddy only deepened their appreciation for the dog who had brought so much light into their lives. The new arrangement with Buddy, or Max as the man called him, was unconventional, but it worked in a way that felt almost magical. The Parker family and the man, whose name was George, formed an unlikely bond through their shared love for this extraordinary dog. Buddy seemed to thrive in the dual arrangement, splitting his time between the Parkers' bustling household and George's quiet, solitary home. Tommy, being so young, adjusted quickly to the idea. To him, Buddy leaving for a few days was like a game. Megan explained it as Buddy going on little adventures. And each time Buddy returned, Tommy would rush to the door, shouting, "Buddy's back!" The reunion was always filled with giggles, tail wags, and Tommy wrapping his small arms around the dog in a fierce hug. For George, having Buddy back in his life, even part-time, was like rediscovering a missing piece of himself. George had been through a lot in recent years. He'd lost his wife to illness, and the move that separated him from Max had been a desperate attempt to start fresh. But losing Max had left him with a lingering sense of guilt and emptiness. Now, seeing Buddy again, knowing he had thrived and become a hero, brought George a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. On Buddy's George days, the two would take long walks through the woods, a favorite activity from their old life. George would talk to Buddy as if he were a person, sharing stories about his late wife, his memories of Max as a puppy, and his gratitude for the Parker family. "You've done well for yourself, Buddy," George would say, scratching behind the dog's ears as they rested on a fallen log. "You've always had a big heart, but what you did for that little boy, that's something special." Buddy would wag his tail, leaning into George's touch, as if he understood every word. Meanwhile, at the Parker household, Buddy's absence was always felt on the days he spent with George. Tommy would occasionally ask, "When's Buddy coming back?" And Megan would remind him gently, in just a few days, sweetheart. He's visiting George right now. But those days apart made Buddy's return all the sweeter. The Parker home seemed to come alive the moment Buddy walked through the door. Tommy would drag him into the playroom, showing him all the new things he'd built or learned in Buddy's absence. And Buddy would follow, his tail wagging as if he'd never left. One weekend, George invited the Parkers over to his home. It was a modest house on the edge of town, surrounded by woods and fields. George had spent years tending to the property, and it showed in the well-kept garden and the neat rows of firewood stacked by the porch. The Parkers arrived with Tommy bouncing in his car seat, eagerly asking, "Buddy here?" When George opened the door, Buddy rushed out to greet them, his tail wagging furiously. Tommy squealed in delight, throwing his arms around the dog. "Buddy," George smiled, stepping aside to let the Parkers in. "Come on in. I've got some tea on, and I thought we could sit out back. It's a beautiful day." The backyard was a sprawling field bordered by trees, with a small pond glinting in the afternoon sun. George had set up a few chairs around a fire pit, and Megan immediately felt the peaceful charm of the place. Tommy, of course, was more interested in exploring, with Buddy trotting faithfully beside him. As they sat together, George shared stories about Max's younger days, how he had found him as a stray puppy, skinny and scared, and how he'd nursed him back to health. "He was always special," George said, his voice warm with nostalgia. "Even as a pup, he had this calmness about him, like he understood more than he let on." Megan nodded, her eyes on Buddy and Tommy as they played by the pond. "He's still like that," she said. "He just knows. It's like he understands everything going on around him." Dan, sipping his tea, chimed in. "He's brought something to our family we didn't even know we needed. He's more than just a dog. He's Buddy." George smiled, his gaze soft. "I think he's exactly where he's meant to be, with both of us." As the afternoon turned to evening, Tommy grew tired from all the running and playing. Megan scooped him up, his head resting on her shoulder as he yawned. "Thank you for inviting us, George," she said. "It's been wonderful." George nodded, his smile gentle. "Thank you for sharing Buddy with me. It means more than I can say." The drive home was quiet, with Tommy falling asleep in his car seat and Buddy dozing in the back. Megan glanced at Dan, her heart full. "It's funny," she said softly. "When Buddy first came into our lives, I thought it was about him saving Tommy. But now I think, maybe he saved all of us." Dan reached over to squeeze her hand. "Yeah, I think you're right." As the months passed, the arrangement with Buddy continued, and the bond between the Parkers and George deepened. They became like an extended family, brought together by a dog who seemed to embody the best parts of all of them: loyalty, resilience, and love. One spring day, as the cherry blossoms bloomed and the world seemed to wake from its winter slumber, the Parker family and George decided to have a picnic together. They spread a blanket under the shade of a large oak tree, with Buddy lying happily in the middle, his tail thumping as Tommy fed him bits of sandwich crust. "Buddy's the luckiest dog in the world," Megan said, smiling as she watched the scene. "Two families, all the love he could ever want." George chuckled. "I think we're the lucky ones." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Buddy stood and stretched, his eyes scanning the horizon. For a moment, he seemed to pause, his ears twitching as if catching a distant sound. Then, with a satisfied wag of his tail, he settled back down, his head resting on Tommy's lap. And in that moment, under the fading light of the day, it was clear to everyone that Buddy had found his place. Not just with one family, but with all of them, with the people who loved him and whom he loved in return. Buddy wasn't just a dog. He was a reminder of everything that mattered, of kindness, connection, and the enduring power of love. As time passed, Buddy became a fixture in the lives of both the Parker family and George. He navigated his dual homes with ease, seeming to understand that he belonged to both. It was as if Buddy had the rare ability to create unity wherever he went, effortlessly weaving together the threads of two families into one shared story. Tommy continued to grow, his once wobbly steps becoming confident strides. With every new milestone, Buddy was there, his silent cheerleader and loyal companion. When Tommy spoke his first full sentence, it was to Buddy. "Buddy, come play." Megan had captured the moment on her phone, her laughter ringing out as Tommy tugged on Buddy's leash to lead him toward the sandbox. "Buddy's going to end up in all our family photos," Megan joked one evening as she flipped through pictures on her phone. "He's in more of these than Dan is. That's because Buddy listens when you tell him to smile," Dan replied with a grin, earning a playful nudge from his wife. For George, Buddy's presence had become a source of healing. He had spent years grieving the loss of his wife and the dog he thought he'd never see again. But now he found himself smiling more, his days filled with purpose. On the evenings when Buddy stayed with him, George would sit on the porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset as Buddy lay at his feet. The quiet moments felt like a balm to his soul, a reminder that life, though unpredictable, could still hold beauty and connection. One summer evening, the Parkers invited George over for a barbecue. The backyard was alive with the sounds of sizzling food, the clinking of glasses, and Tommy's delighted squeals as he ran through the sprinkler. Buddy, as always, was in the middle of it all, his tail wagging furiously as Tommy tried to splash him with water. "Looks like he's getting his bath whether he wants one or not," George said, laughing as he watched the scene unfold. Dan handed George a plate of food, gesturing for him to sit. "Thanks for coming," he said. "It's nice to have you here." George nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's nice to feel like I'm part of something again," he said. "You and Megan. You've made me feel welcome in a way I didn't think was possible." Megan, overhearing the conversation, smiled. "Your family, George. Buddy brought us together, and now we're stuck with you." George chuckled, raising his glass in a mock toast. "To Buddy, the glue that holds us all together." The evening stretched on, the sky transitioning from soft pastels to a blanket of stars. As the fireflies began to flicker in the darkness, Tommy crawled into Megan's lap, his eyes heavy with sleep. Buddy settled beside them, his head resting on Megan's knee. "Mommy," Tommy murmured, his voice drowsy. "Buddy loves us, right?" Megan kissed the top of his head, her heart full. "He loves us very much, sweetheart. And we love him too." The following week, something unexpected happened. Megan received a letter in the mail from the local animal shelter. Curious, she opened it and was surprised to find an invitation to an upcoming event honoring rescue animals. The shelter wanted to recognize Buddy for his heroic actions and had invited both the Parkers and George to attend. "This is incredible," Megan said, showing the letter to Dan. "Buddy's getting an award." Dan grinned. "Well, he deserves it. He's practically a legend around here." When they told George about the event, his face lit up with pride. "I wouldn't miss it for the world," he said. "Max, Buddy, he's always been special. It's about time the rest of the world sees that too." On the day of the event, the shelter was bustling with activity. People from all over the community had gathered to celebrate the animals that had made a difference in their lives. There were stories of dogs who had alerted families to fires, cats who had comforted children through illnesses, and even a parrot who had saved its owner by mimicking a smoke alarm. But Buddy's story stood out. When it was time for his award, the crowd fell silent as Megan stepped up to the microphone, holding Tommy's hand. "Buddy came into our lives on one of the scariest nights we've ever faced," Megan began, her voice steady but emotional. "He found our son, Tommy, when he was lost in the woods, and he stayed with him all night, keeping him safe. But Buddy didn't just save Tommy that night, he brought our family closer. He reminded us of the importance of love, loyalty, and compassion." She paused, looking out at the audience. George was sitting in the front row, his eyes shining with emotion. "What makes Buddy's story even more special," Megan continued, "is that he brought us together with George, his first owner. Buddy has shown us that love knows no boundaries and that family can take many forms." The crowd erupted into applause as Megan stepped back, and Buddy was brought forward to receive his medal, a shiny silver circle engraved with the words "Heroic Companion." Tommy clapped enthusiastically, shouting, "Yay, Buddy," as the dog wagged his tail, seemingly oblivious to the attention. After the ceremony, People lined up to meet Buddy, taking pictures and sharing their own stories of the animals they loved. Buddy took it all in stride, his calm demeanor never wavering as he greeted each person with a wag of his tail. That night, as the Parker family and George returned home, there was a sense of quiet satisfaction among them. Buddy lay in his usual spot on the living room rug, the medal resting on the mantel above him. Tommy curled up beside him, his small hand resting on the dog's back. "Today was perfect," Megan said, leaning against Dan as they sat on the couch. "Buddy deserves all the recognition in the world." Dan nodded, his gaze fixed on the sleeping dog and the little boy who loved him. "He's more than a hero," he said softly. "He's our heart."